So, welcome to the session on peace education in Korea, Afghanistan, and Somaliland towards a conflict-sensitive approach by Kevin Kester. And Kevin Kester, he has a PhD from Cambridge and is a tenure-track assistant professor of international education and global affairs and cross-appointed to the Graduate School of Education, the Department of Education and School of Global Affairs in Keimyung University in South Korea. He's also an editorial board member of Teaching in Higher Education, the Journal of Peace Education, Review of Education, Pedagogy and Cultural Studies, book review editor of In Factis Pax. He's the co-chair of the Peace Education Special Interest Group of the Comparative and International Education Society, the CIS, and he just published a new book called The United Nations and Higher Education, Peace Building, Social Justice, and Global Cooperation in the 21st Century. I know Kevin, have known Kevin for many years. I met him when he was coming out of a program of peace education in Costa Rica. And he has been working all around the world on peace education. He's very committed to the field of peace education, which is a topic that is very relevant today. And well, it has been relevant for the history of humanity, I guess, but particularly relevant today. And a topic that is very dear to social pedagogy. So Kevin, the floor is yours.
First, Daniel, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. What I'm going to do now is share the slides with you. I have a PowerPoint, but unfortunately you won't be able to see my face as I'm sharing the PowerPoint. So I'll just share this with you, but you'll be missing me. Okay, and welcome to everybody who's joining for this session now. I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes here on the theme of peace education in Korea, Afghanistan, and Somaliland. This is an ongoing project that I have toward a conflict-sensitive approach. In my work, I'm a consultant to various UN organizations, including my work with the UN in Somalia and national government institutes here in Korea. So my research is global and local simultaneously. And the main message that I have today is this: addressing conflict and peace is integral for quality education today. Whether this is in developing and conflict-affected contexts like Somaliland and Afghanistan, or in stable and developed contexts like Korea and the UK. Addressing conflict is integral for education everywhere. So in the following slides, I'm going to overview why this agenda matters, detail the research project, discuss the research context, outline a conflict-sensitive toolkit, and indicate the implications of this work. So why does it matter? As far as we know, today there are somewhere between 57 to 60 million school-age children out of school. And nearly half of these children are in contexts affected by conflict, with it expected that by 2030, well over 2/3 of children out of school and 80% of the world's poor will be living in conflict zones. We know as well from research coming out of Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and Afghanistan that lack of access to education is a driver of conflict. We also know that biased and radicalized curriculum contributes to conflict. Further, we know that inequitable access to quality education in stable contexts, like the UK and Korea, leads to drastically different life outcomes that may feed into resentment and feelings of relative deprivation that could foster anger and further contribute to conflict. So this has led the World Bank to declare that conflict and insecurity is the primary development challenge of our time. Hence, if the international community wants to ensure universal access to quality education and safe places for learning, then addressing conflict and peace is an imperative. Achieving the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals is dependent on mitigating conflict and providing equitable quality education, as well as ensuring that that education is conflict sensitive. At the same time, conflict is not limited to developing contexts. The increase in violent conflict in recent years is in middle-income countries. Almost 9 out of 10 violent deaths in 2018 were in countries not at war in the traditional sense. This is from research from the Carnegie Foundation. For example, South Africa had twice as many deaths as the war-torn country South Sudan. And the Philippines had more homicides than Afghanistan, as many homicides as Afghanistan, and more than Somalia and the Democratic Republic of Congo. While in the United States, gun violence in schools has reached epidemic proportions. Hence, not only is conflict and peace building an urgent matter for conflict-affected context, but it is an important agenda for all countries and educators today. There is then a need to rethink what conflict-affected means and to address its root causes, as well as to plan educational responses to these diverse sets of conflict that do not exacerbate them and that open instead the possibility for social transformation. So the 2 points on the previous slide, that conflict affects education and education can contribute to conflict, require conflict and peace to be studied not only individually and psychologically, but it must also be examined socially, culturally, and structurally. That is, conflict is direct, cultural, and structural. So what I've done with 2 interdependent research projects in the past year is to conduct 2 social pedagogy-oriented participatory action research projects using workshops as a research methodology. The first of these projects was on decolonizing higher education in Korea, and the second one is this ongoing project on conflict-sensitive education. And what I have found, both empirically and theoretically, is that often the educators, peace workers, and development practitioners are implicated in the maintenance and production of the very forms of violence that they seek to mitigate. So at the same time, I theorize the sorts of policy, curricular, and pedagogical responses that might help. So this project on conflict-sensitive higher education is funded by the Korea National Research Foundation. The project just began in May and it will continue for 2 more years. And it involves document analysis, interviews, and observations with university educators in Afghanistan and Somaliland, as well as participatory workshops with more than 100 academics in Korea. It's using a very similar methodology to the one that was used on the Decolonizing Higher Education project. So the impetus for this project is the increasing internationalization of Korean higher education, with questions arising about how educational professionals should respond creatively and effectively to changing demographics and citizenships in classrooms and universities. Some of the contributing factors are the demographic cliff and the low birth rate in Korea. This has led to a reduction in the number of workers and the number of students in universities, which has led to corporations and schools to look elsewhere for workers and students. As of 2019, there were 160,000 international students in Korean universities. Most of them are from the global south, primarily China and Vietnam, but also many are from conflict-affected contexts like Mexico, Nigeria, Pakistan, Yemen, North Korea, and Iran. This increase in migration has further diversified the society and led to contestation between different groups. So it's important in this changing context that higher education professionals in Korean universities adapt their theoretical and pedagogical approaches, asking how could Korean-based educators work more sensitively and justly with students from conflict-affected contexts. So now you're probably wondering why Somaliland and Afghanistan. Both of these are conflict-affected contexts. They're both divided societies. Somalia is divided largely between Somaliland, which in the upper northwest part of the country is a self-proclaimed independent state that seceded from southern Somalia in 1991. Afghanistan is largely divided between urban and rural groups. Both countries have active higher education institutions that are addressing conflict and peace building directly, which I am working with, including the American University of Afghanistan in Kabul and the University of Hargeisa in Somaliland. And both are Islamic cultural centers, which is important to the work of what's going on in Korea today with a growing Muslim community in Korea and challenges of integrating that community into Korean society. So the culmination of this project is going to be the creation of a conflict-sensitive toolkit. Because I've just started this project, I have not done the interviews or the observations with the educators in Somaliland and Afghanistan yet, but I have tentatively put together a conflict-sensitive toolkit that will be adapted throughout the process. So I'm going to share that toolkit with you now and look forward to comments that you may have about this. So through examining the literature and drawing off of the previous project on decolonizing higher education, I have identified 6 areas for university academics and other practitioners to address conflict sensitivity in the higher education classroom. These 6 areas include onto-epistemic changes, curricular possibilities, pedagogic responses, methodological tweaks, institutional policies, and scholarly practices. To the first area, onto-epistemic changes, the starting point for the toolkit is an onto-epistemological shift that lays the foundation for the other interventions to follow. This includes changing the way that one thinks about conflict. Beginning with onto-epistemic shifts means lecturers training themselves through continual professional reflexivity toward becoming comfortable with conflict and controversy in the class, and sensitive to different perspectives in the room. Here, conflict is seen as holding the potential for positive social transformation. More importantly, I emphasize the ontological aspect of this work. That is, the right not only to think differently, but to actually be and act differently. It is not enough to claim to allow difference in theory, but it must be possible to practice difference in reality. In other words, focusing on the inclusion of diverse voices through, for example, calling on international students in class or reading global text without challenging epistemological dominance would be counterproductive and insufficient. As much as allowing ontological diversity would, but not epistemological diversity, would also be inadequate. Hence, the objective of the onto-epistemic shift is to see conflict-sensitive education as systemic critique, rather than, or in addition to, an empathy-building exercise that seeks to foster intercultural appreciation and sympathy. This position argues for the pluralism of ontological and epistemological possibilities, questioning the presumed goodness or superiority of anyone over another. Onto-epistemological pluralism is dynamic and contextually relevant. And this takes me to the second element, curricular possibilities. Among the curricular possibilities, I suggest that educators look at the reading lists that are included within syllabi, especially for core theory courses, and check that the readings are not all or mostly white or Korean men. Ensure that theoretical perspectives are included from outside the European or the Korean nationalist tradition and beyond the global north. A starting point in Korea would be ensuring that diverse Korean thinkers and scholarship, such as feminist and critical perspectives, are included within the readings and discussions, as well as examination of Korea's long history of conflict and colonization. Of course, it should not stop here. Expanding more widely beyond Western or Korean perspectives to include other scholarship from the Global South is necessary. Raewyn Connell illustrates well in her book, Southern Theory, the sorts of transformative insights thinking with and through Southern theory provides for teachers and students. Here, I want to especially emphasize the contributions from conflict-affected societies, such as the lessons learned from Afghanistan, Colombia, Cuba, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and Somalia. Additionally, educators should change the violent imagery of the Global South within textbooks and disrupt the notion that the Global South is in the need of being saved by the Global North. The questions to be asked include, what lessons could scholars learn from those in conflict-affected contexts? And how are conflict-affected societies intimately linked with more stable societies? Conflict-sensitive pedagogies inquire into why what counts as knowledge counts, and points out that indigenous knowledges and local practices of teaching and learning are not often in use within higher education classrooms in both conflict-affected and stable contexts. Here, integrating teaching by and for those affected by conflict and through indigenous methods is integral to fostering a holistic, conflict-sensitive classroom. Linda Tuiwai-Smith, for example, promotes counter-storytelling and reclaiming as some methods sensitive to marginalized voices. In her book, Decolonizing Methodologies, she offers 25 such methods, which also include testimonies, intervening, gendering, reframing, democratizing, and sharing. In addition, in classroom teaching, lecturers could use transrational pedagogies to engage diverse faculties. For example, drama, theater, meditation, the arts, storytelling, and nature walks. These alternative pedagogies get students out of their heads and expand education into the body and spirit. An important distinction to remember here is that dialogue is not inherently superior to any other learning modality, and it may indeed exclude certain students from learning who are more quiet and uncomfortable with logocentric methods. Hence, the use of multiple pedagogies that engage different learning preferences is critical to support onto-epistemic diversity. Fourth, methodological tweaks. Walter Mignolo contends that what is necessary from a methodological perspective is to alter the terms of the conversation, which allows for a discussion of Southern epistemologies to emerge. Rather than taking the stopgap measure of simply changing the content of research and teaching, paying lip service to conflict sensitivity while preserving the underlying inequalities that it seeks to challenge, the emphasis should be on critically questioning who has the right to reproduce knowledge and what function this knowledge production serves in sustaining inequalities and conflict in the world. The concept of positionality is a crucial starting point. It is necessary for researchers to examine their own relationship to global power relations, their epistemic position, and the standpoint from which they address their research questions. One of the more concrete ways in which methodologies can be turned towards conflict-sensitive practice is by exploring an expanded selection of sources and data. For example, by challenging the obsession with quantification. For instance, researchers and educators could focus here on the contextualization of knowledge and practice, thereby offering personal and local counter stories that complement or challenge more popular nomothetic approaches. There's also scope here for researchers to co-author with colleagues from conflict-affected societies in the Global South and to conduct research across languages, cultures, and contexts, employing transcultural methodologies. In the Korean context, there are other particular challenges to be addressed. Most importantly, the invisibility of a variety of migrant communities, genders, and exploited socioeconomic classes. A potential solution presents itself here in the foregrounding of student experiences in the international and intercultural classroom, as well as increasing discussions not only of the migrant, gender, and class experience within Korea, but also the experiences of Koreans abroad who, escaping from war, poverty, and tyranny in the 1950s to the 80s, are often elided in the national narrative. For institutional policies, institutions should strive to ensure that marginalized communities are hired into permanent positions instead of precariously created contracts. In doing so, it is also critical that institutions are sensitive to hiring from amongst the various ethnic, class, gender, and religious groups that are involved in a conflict to avoid exacerbating the issues. For example, in Korea, hiring staff from only Shia or Sunni Islam could exacerbate tensions amongst members of the other sect within Korea. This is a very real concern, as many Yemeni refugees have settled on the southern island of Jeju and received work there. Rising xenophobia and fear of Islam has emerged. Universities then have a role to educate about Islam and to ensure equitable access to education for vulnerable groups through, for example, scholarship schemes or providing safe havens for refugees. For instance, in Korea, university professors have special protection under Korean law. This bars them from being arrested on university campuses, unless, of course, there's been a very serious crime committed. The same protection could be extended to refugee and vulnerable migrant communities. Moreover, universities could set up ongoing committees to reflect on the institution's role in perpetuating or mitigating conflict. And finally, for the last area of the toolkit, for scholarly practices, a useful approach, as I expressed in the section on curricular possibilities, is by theorizing with Southern theories. These could include, for example, the scholarship of Ali Shariati from Iran, Anibal Quijano from Peru, Boaventura de Sousa Santos from Portugal, Gustavo Escobar from Mexico, Julius Nyerere from Tanzania, and so on and so forth. By theorizing from a Southern perspective, new findings emerge that are not possible from more traditional routes of European or North American theorizing. In other words, I question what new findings might be produced if scholars theorize through the work of Shariati, Quijano, and de Sousa Santos instead of Bourdieu, Deleuze, and Foucault. Furthermore, scholars sensitive to conflict could publish locally and in regional languages, as well as open access where possible. This expands the audience and makes scholarship available to communities often excluded from access to such research. Many times, these are the very communities that provided the raw data for that research. But it is, of course, crucial here to still identify quality local journals. The research must be produced with sound method and rigor. In addition, whether publishing in local or international venues, academic or popular media, research could be de-scholarized. That is, scholars could avoid the use of excessive academic jargon and inaccessible language. This was a comment that was brought up frequently in the project on decolonizing higher education. So in conclusion, the conflict-sensitive strategies introduced throughout this presentation, they are just small but useful adjustments for combating injustice and othering and research and teaching. And I should finally note that I've not attempted to be exhaustive throughout this presentation of this toolkit. And then on this last slide, these are some recent publications that I have out on peace education or decolonizing higher education. Okay, so that's it for the 20 minutes on the conflict-sensitive toolkit, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.